Hello everyone, this is Dr. Bill Gazgan and welcome to the lecture 7. We have covered quite variety of things in the last 6 lectures, and today in this lecture we will continue. We will continue to deepen the lecture that we gave. In the last lecture, as you could remember, we talked about the left-right continuum, how they are divided, why they are divided the way they are divided, and what they represent. And we studied, we go over the ideologies such as liberalism, conservatism, what does it mean to be a democratic left, what does it mean to be a conservative right, etc., etc. So this is kind of as I told you before, lecture 6 and 7 is kind of connected, and it tries to give you a broad review of the terminologies that we are trying to look for to develop our vocabulary when we read stuff and when we analyze stuff in the political arena in the world. So why classify political systems? Well, understanding politics and governments to facilitate evolution of political systems. And guess till now, who did we classify? Who we studied, who classified political regimes? Aristotle. Again, here is Aristotle's classification. You remember from lecture 5. Democracy, oligarchy, tyranny is the bad regimes. Democracy ruled by many, oligarchy ruled by few, tyranny ruled by one. Right? And Aristotle formulated his classification by asking 2 questions. Who rules? Who benefits from the rule? Are these guys ruling for their own interest, for their own selfish interest, or for the common interest? All right? And I told you that tyranny and monarchy, the one guy is ruling, oligarch aristocracy is, is kind of coupled. Tyranny and monarchy is coupled, oligarchy is coupled because few guys are running. Democracy and politics is coupled because many people are running. Ruling, sorry, when I say running, I mean ruling. But polity, many are ruling for the common interest. In democracy, many are running or ruling, but they're ruling or deciding for their common, for their own selfish interest. So that's why it helps. Here we have more talk, and here we have a more note for you about the U.S. War of Independence, the Constitution, the French Revolution, 1789, right? Parliamentary government in the UK. We have more of the kind of developments. We have monarchies, republics, or autocratic or constitutional regimes. Well, I told you how French Revolution created a new constitution, how U.S. independence, Declaration of Independence, led to a new constitutional regimes. Not autocracies. Autocracy, what does it mean? It's an introduction to political science, so I should be careful. Autocracy, maybe that's something you never heard. Autocracy, basically means above law, beyond law. Well, who is beyond the law? Who is above the law? Well, those who have absolute power, those who claim to have an absolute power. So the kings were autocrats. All right. Well, constitutional regimes are those regimes that try to limit the power of the ruler and holds the ruler to accountable because there are certain limits and there are certain principles, rights that no one can violate. Right? So this was a very common thing that existed in 20th century. We are just giving you more kind of concepts and more analytics. A capitalist world, a communist world, and a developing world. All right? During the 20th century, these distinctions have been sharpened further. All right? And we have 3 worlds typology in the 1960s. The 3 worlds classification of political system. A capitalist world, when we used to say capitalist world, we meant those countries such as US, UK, Japan, Germany, France, basically the European countries. When we say a communist, and which was classified as Second World War, we meant Russia, we meant Eastern Europe, and the other countries. Be kardeş, yani biraz sessiz olman gerekecek ha. Yani bugüne kadar çok ders verdim ama böyle yüksek sesten konuşanını görmedim. Kaçıncıdır uyaracağım ama hadi bakalım. Ben burada anlatmaya çalışırım bir şeyi. Senin sesin benimkini bastırır ya.
Tamam hocam sorayım.
Nereden başlayalım?
Aynı kaldığınız yerden.
Tamam canım.
İstediğiniz cümleden başlayın, ben orayı kurgulayayım.
Tamam canım. So, the three world war classification of political systems is a capitalist first world, a communist second world war, and a developing third world. And as I gave you the examples, we have the capitalist first world, US, UK, etc. A communist second world war, USSR. Back then it was Russia was called USSR. And a developing third world. Developing third world would be the countries such as Turkey, such as, don't know, you name it, India, Pakistan. These were considered as third world. That is, underdeveloped countries who are trying to catch up with the first world. All right, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and then we also have a concept. The reason why they are third world is because they are less developed than the capitalist first world and the communist second world war. A developing third world, and then they also define a concept called a fourth world, which was quite underdeveloped, and those are countries in Africa, quite impoverished ones, and that would be categorized as the fourth world. Okay, three world classification had economic, ideological, political, and strategic dimensions. Well, economically, the most industrialized regimes were first in economic terms. So if we talk about the first world countries, we are talking about the most industrialized, advanced economies of the world, such as US. That's why US is the first example for the first world. Okay, communist regimes, second world, and the less developed countries of the third world. Here it says that they were economically dependent. Yes, they are dependent on the money that they borrow, all right, from the First World War. Between the First World War and Second World War, as I told you, the ideology of First World War was capitalism, and the Second World War was communist. The capitalist, of course, believes in the private ownership of property and the maximization of profit in corporations, whereas communist world back then, when the Soviet Union was, believed in the state organization of all economic sphere and the state-owned enterprise. Okay, and here, of course, for a very long time, these the First World and Second World War, the capitalists and the communists, they clashed. What we call Cold War. If you probably have heard of Cold War. Cold War was an ideological war. It's called a Cold War because there is no direct fight, but there is an ideological fight and fight for influencing the globe, given by the US, representing the West capitalist first world, and at the opposite was the communist Soviet Union. And the race between these two were termed Cold War. They engaged with arms race, who would make more nuclear weapons. They engaged with espionaging each other, and they engaged with which country they will influence more. So, for instance, in Middle East, whereas US will try to find its allies over there in the Middle East, Soviet Union would seek for its own allies in the Middle East. So they would have this kind of a proxy wars that they will fight with each other over the influence. For instance, in Afghanistan, United States, armed and supported the rebel groups against Soviet invasion. When Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the US helped the rebel groups such as Mujahideen to come against the Soviet Union and fight against the Soviet Union. And that's how the Taliban also was born laterwards. Although United States officials don't talk about this much, it's a pretty well-known fact how growing or funding and giving arms to the local rebels during the back in Soviet Union era, during the Cold War, opened the way for these Islamic groups, jihadist groups. Okay, so but what happens in 1989 when the Soviet Union collapses? But what happens is that Fukuyama is a name of a writer, is a thinker. He wrote a book called End of History. What he meant by end of history is that that now that Western Soviet Union has collapsed, the only way for the future is Western liberal democracy. And Fukuyama optimistically believed that Western liberal democracy and capitalist democracy has won the battle, and now it's the end of history because there will be no rival ideologies against Western liberal democracy. That it would be the only existing unchallenged ideology of the whole world now, because throughout the Cold War, we had to fight between the two ideologies. Which one is better? Which one is more right? Which one is which one will prevail over the other? The one was Western capitalist liberal democracy, the other one was communist regime. So Fukuyama, when the Soviet Union fell, said that now there is no more enemy against Western liberal democracy, and it's the end of history because there will be no more conflict anymore. That the Western liberal democracy will not be challenged anymore, right? Well, now you see that the fight with ISIS in an Islamic fundamentalism, we can see many different regimes, authoritarian regimes forming around the world. There are so many things going on in the world that tells us that it's not the end of history, that Western liberal democracy is actually even decaying in United States as well with the rise of Trump now, right? So, but let's talk more about the typologies. More classifications for you. But these are classifications based on institutionalization, based on institutions, okay? For instance, for classification, we have a constitutional institutional approach, what we call. That is, we classify regimes based on the constitution and their institutions. For instance, we have, in this constitutional institutional approach, we ask the question whether the system is presidential system or parliamentary system, whether the system is a federal system or unitary system. What do I mean by that? Presidential and parliamentary system. What's the difference between the two? Well, United States is a presidential system, right? Germany is parliamentary system. What is the difference between the two? Well, just to briefly, in parliamentary system, UK is also parliamentary system. In parliamentary system, you have a strong prime ministers. You don't have presidents. If you do have presidents, they are only a symbolic role, like in Germany. Did you ever hear Germany's president? No. You only hear about Merkel because she's the chancellor. She is the prime minister. She is in the charge. In parliamentary system, like Tony Blair did, you become the head of your political party. If your political party, you go to parliamentary elections. If it wins, you become prime minister. You run the country. Well, in presidential system, we have different things. Presidents get elected, not the parties. In presidential system, as you can see, there's an election between Hillary Clinton and Trump. Okay, Trump was a candidate of Republicans, and Hillary was a candidate of Democrats. But Democrats and Republicans, they had their, during the presidential election, they had their own political votes for the congresses. But then each individual voted who should be a president, whether Clinton or Trump. In parliamentary system, you don't vote for president for 4 years, which will be the head of the state, which will run things. So the executive in presidential system, the executive, that is who is in government, who charges, not the legislative. The executive who runs the office is presidents, are presidents. Whereas in parliamentary system, those who run the country are the prime ministers, not the presidents. Okay? And federal and unitary approach. Federal system, for instance, United States is a federal system, whereas France is a unitary system. Well, what do we mean by, what exactly do we mean by this? What exactly do we mean by federal system or unitary system? Well, federal system is that you have many different autonomous states, but then they are all connected to a central state in the capital. Take an example, United States. You have California, you have Florida, you have a lot of states, more than 50, but they have their own governor, they have their own internal kind of running things, but then they all pay taxes to the federal central system in Washington, D.C. Okay, that's the federal system. So federal system, it allows a unity within diversity. It allows federal system allows more power to the local level, whereas unitary, the local institutions do not have quite big power. The power is more centralized, like in France. Well, UK used to be a unitary, but it became more federal as it implemented a devolution back in 1980s, which gave more power to Wales, Scotland, gave a local autonomy, gave a local governing body to these regions, right? So the federalism allows more local power to the local place, whereas unitary keeps it as centralized. So that's how you can distinguish the federal from unitary, and as I told you before, presidential from parliamentary. And what do we have? We have more classifications here. We can call Western polyarchies, post-communist regimes, East Asia regimes, Islamic regimes and military regimes. Well, Islamic regimes, well, just 5 minutes ago I was talking about Fukuyama, the end of history. Well, Western polyarchies are what we mean Western liberal democracy. Polyarchy is a concept coined by Dahl, Robert Dahl, which talks about a polyarchy is a place where you have elections and where you have everyone is freely attend to elections, and you have freedom of speech, you have civil liberties and political liberties to fulfill those needs, to fulfill the elections. So, and those are called Western polyarchies. Post-communist regimes, well, we talk about communist regimes, so we would say Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, Slovenia, Poland, Russia, these are all post-communist regimes because they used to be communist regimes, you know, during the USSR. That's the label, post-communist regimes. We have East Asia regimes. What do you mean by East Asia? Well, for instance, South Korea, Singapore. These are called East Asia regimes. Malaysia, Indonesia. Why? Because East Asian regimes, they are capitalist. They're quite capitalist, these regimes, but they're also authoritarian, okay? And so sometimes they feel the need to say East Asia regimes. And here we have Islamic regimes. Well, so we don't only have a liberal, Western liberal democracy, the triumph of Western liberal democracy, as you can see. We have different regimes that are contending the Western liberal democracy. That it's not always at the end of history, since the US is fighting with ISIS now in Mosul and Raqqa. Now, as we speak now, Islamic regimes, Saudi Arabia is an Islamic regime. They implement Sharia. And now we can see that in Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood came to power with elections and they wanted to implement more Islamic regimes, but then they were toppled by a military coup, okay? So Islamic regimes, well, ISIS has formed a state, Islamic State, which claimed to be a Khalifa and which claimed to implement the Sharia on earth, and it called itself a state, an Islamic regime. So we have a rising Islamic fundamentalism, religion becoming very prominent in the region of Middle East, and they are trying to create an Islamic regimes. Okay. Well, and talk about a polyarchy, and a polyarchy is what I said, coined by Robert Dahl, and I said that it's a great definition for liberal democracy. And how do we distinguish polyarchical regimes? Well, I told you that first there has to be elections every once 4 years, free, fair elections where everyone can participate. And also I said that it has to involve civil and political liberties. Well, here we have a summary. The polyarchical regimes have two essential features: high tolerance of opposition, and participation in politics, right, which is open to responsive. So tolerance of opposition, that is, you have political parties coming to elections. Sometimes they win, sometimes the other parties win, you never know. And that you ensure that everyone can participate to politics with the given civil and political liberties, okay? Well, polyarchies in practice, when you look at the polyarchies in practice, you can see a majority democracy, okay? And you can see a consensus democracies, okay? And that's a distinction given by Liebhardt. Arend Liebhardt is or he also coined the term consociational democracy, consensus democracy. Look at here, majority democracies includes Westminster model UK. UK used to be a majority democracy, but it's not anymore because it went through a devolution, all right? Consociational democracies are, unlike unitary states, are more close to federal. You remember I talked about federalism and unitary state. Unitary state means a centralized, whereas federal systems means more devolution to the power. Well, majority democracies are usually unitary systems, whereas constitutional democracies are those who devolve the power. But we will talk more about this in the coming lecture, which will be our last lecture. And then we will kind of make a review of what we have covered so far, and then finish this course on Introduction to Political Science. Well, thanks for your attention and the listening that you gave. I will see you in our next and last lecture. Until now, stay well, and I hope you enjoyed the lectures. See you. Bye-bye.